So welcome. It's great to see so many of you here. And I'm particularly glad to see so many younger people here because I've been running these conversations one a term since since my second year as master. And very often students are too busy. So it is good to see a good turnout of students today. So my guest probably needs no introduction, Jocelyn Burnell, well known to Cambridge, because of course she did her PhD, not in this college, but in what was then Newhall, now Murray Edwards, has a very high public profile, and I want to try and dig down a bit about why she became an astronomer, and what happened when she did, which is probably the bit that's more interesting. So let's start. You didn't come from a family of scientists.
No, that's right. My father was an architect, which is an interesting subject because it crosses the art and design and the structural engineering. So he undoubtedly could have been a scientist if he wanted to, but he was an architect, yeah. And I'm not aware of other scientists in the family.
So it just came out of the blue that you decided you wanted to be a physicist, an astronomer?
Apparently, as soon as we started doing science, as soon as I got to do science in secondary school, we had physics that first term and I came top of the class. So I decided it was easy. I got 97%, and the thing I got wrong was the speed of light.
Oh dear.
We worked in old units and, what's the speed of light? And I wrote down 186,000 miles per second, which is the right answer. And for the first time in my life, I looked at that number. I thought, that's awfully big. Changed miles per second to miles per hour. Now, it's a good idea to look at your answer.
Yes.
Just don't do it for the first time in an exam.
No, that's probably very wise. Now, actually, I mean, you talk about your secondary school and doing physics, but you didn't actually have a particularly easy ride to secondary school, did you?
No, I didn't. I failed the 11 plus.
That was the exam which segregated people according to whether or not they were academic at 11 in our day.
Yeah. And for a woman who failed the 11 plus in those days, the options were being a hairdresser, a filing clerk, a secretary, an unqualified nurse. That was about it.
Yes.
Because you were expected only to get married and not work. So you didn't need a training. Subsequently learnt that some areas had a higher pass mark in that exam for the girls than the boys, because girls were only going to get married, but at age 11, 12, girls are brighter than boys typically, and too many girls were passing the exam and cluttering up the grammar schools where they needed to have the boys getting educated.
Yes.
So they had a higher pass mark for the girls.
I think that went on for a long time. I think it was true in my day. They had quotas. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But you managed to overcome that.
My parents fought with the head teacher. I had been in the so-called prep department of that school. So I think they kind of held him responsible for my failure. And it was already decided I was going away to boarding school at age 13. So I was in the grammar school stream for the first 2 years of secondary.
Okay.
Back in Northern Ireland, yep.
So your parents were determined you would get an education even though you were a girl?
Yeah, and one of the other battles they had to fight was in the first week of term of the first year. It was the Wednesday. A message went round the first year class. This afternoon, boys to such and such a room and girls to such and such. And I thought it was for sport, Wednesday afternoon. But it wasn't. They sent the boys to the science lab and the girls to domestic science. No discussion, no choice. That's the way the universe was.
And would they then have not taught girls science at any point?
No. And I don't think that teacher had ever taught girls. He ended up with 3 girls in the class, and I'm pretty certain it was the first time. And he made us sit right under his nose, right up against the teacher's desk, because clearly we were dynamite.
And you then came top just to rub salt in the wound.
Yeah, I'd love to think the school learnt a lesson, but lessons aren't learnt that quickly, are they?
It didn't transform.
No. Ultimately, probably, but not instantly.
And how much do you think that coloured your desire to do science? Did it make you really, really determined?
If there was any determination, it was for physics rather than for science more broadly.
Right.
Chemistry I thought was okay. We did that in the second term. The third term we did biology. They gave us flowers to draw, label the parts and learn the names.
Yep.
Boring.
Nature study.
Nature study, yeah. Which girls are supposed to be good at.
How's your drawing? Okay. So you had to fight to get to do any science at all. You weren't very impressed by the biology. But you did have teachers who could teach science, at least.
Yes, and even subsequently when I went to a girls' boarding school, which often had trouble getting science teachers, the physics teaching was very, very good. It was really excellent. Chemistry, I did O-level chemistry, and we were asking questions like, why does copper and sulfur and oxygen combine in these proportions? And I see now he should have been teaching us about the periodic table, but I don't think he knew about the periodic table. So he said, God made it so.
Oh, no.
Church school, you can't argue with that.
Doesn't really give you much predictive power, though, does it?
No, it doesn't, no.
Okay, so valency wasn't a phrase that entered his lexicon.
Nope.
Yeah, right. But physics was okay. You had a qualified physics teacher, because that's still such a problem in girls' schools.
He had come out of retirement for a second time to teach us, but he was not only qualified, he was a very, very good teacher.
Oh, so he was a male teacher in a girls' school.
Yep.
Was that unusual?
The science ones were all male, and so was the applied maths teacher.
Right. Okay.
And the applied maths teacher had a regular teaching job in a boys' school and came to us of an evening. So you had applied maths classes at about 6 o'clock in the evening, which is quite hard work, but it was okay.
And were there many girls who responded well to science, or were you odd?
There weren't many doing physics. There were 2 of us in my year,
ultimately
doing A-level physics.
So, that's interesting, because in my school, girls' grammar, there were several girls who did physics, because you had to do physics to do medicine.
Yes.
So
you don't know.
You don't know, no. That's why there aren't girls doing physics A-level. But it used to be that was why there were so many. And certainly in my school, out of 7 of us doing physics A-level, there were 5 who were going to be medics. And 1 who wanted to do maths, and me, yes. So it's...
Minority job.
Minority job.
Yep.
But, I always felt that going to a single-sex school was helpful. No one told me it was that odd to do physics, actually. It didn't really dawn on me. And the evidence now from the Institute of Physics is, of course, very clear that if you go to a single-sex school as a girl, you are more likely to proceed to physics A-level.
Yeah.
But did you realise it was odd at that stage?
It became clearer when I went to university and lived in a women's hall of residence. And then other women would say to me, how can you bear to do physics? Are you sure you want to do physics? At which point you need a best friend who says, it's okay, nobody's asking you to. Although in a sense you are, because if you do something unusual, you're showing other people that maybe they've taken a more conventional route, a more traditional route.
Yes.
So you are actually being slightly confrontational just through your choice of subject.
Did you feel that at the time?
I felt it more because I ended up the only female in the honours physics class.
Out of?
50, 49 men and me.
Right, and my memory is that you had awful experiences in the lecture theatre anyhow.
Well, I was an undergraduate in Glasgow, and it was the tradition at the time in Glasgow that when a woman entered the lecture theatre, all the guys and stamped their feet and catcalled and whistled.
Was that all across the university?
Certainly in the sciences and engineering, yeah.
Right. So if there had been 10 of you, it would still have happened. It wasn't because you were the only one.
No, it happened whenever any women entered the lecture theatre.
And none of the lecturers thought this was unacceptable?
They must have heard because the volume of noise was phenomenal, but nobody did anything.
Well, I'm so glad Cambridge was better. No one tried to do that.
At least in some ways.
Oh, in many ways, I'm sure. No, I mean...
It didn't admit women as equally as men for a long, long time.
Okay,
Whereas,
we were going to get into
other universities did.
Certainly by the time I was doing my degree, I was allowed to get a proper degree. I know when I was first, so I was at Girton, and Girton used to have celebrating women being allowed to get degrees, and I was told this was because before that they'd been called BA tits. And I sniggered, and that was not well received by the dons in the college. It just seemed to me unreasonable that that was the name. Anyhow, moving swiftly on. So you survived that kind of catcalling, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I was lucky in the sense that I knew from my mid-teens that I wanted to be an astronomer. And by the time I left school, I knew I wanted to be a radio astronomer, for which I had to get a physics degree. And if you know what you want to do, then when you come up against an obstacle, you say, how definitely do I want to do this? Because if I do, I've got to get over this obstacle. If you're not that committed, maybe you'll go sideways and do something else. But I knew what I wanted to be.
And they weren't going to put you off?
Not if I could help it.
Were you still coming top in exams?
I came top once in a subsidiary maths exam. And that was a bad mistake. They hadn't revised for it. I had, and they were furious. And there was a real edge to the, thumping and catcalling. But mostly I wasn't top of the physics class. I was somewhere well up the class.
Yeah.
But actually in Glasgow, people normally worked quite hard.
Right. And you knew you wanted to be an astronomer because...
Well, I knew I wanted to be a physicist right from year one of secondary.
Yeah.
Because it was my best subject and I liked it. And then through my teenage years, I was wondering, what kind of physicist am I going to be? My father was very widely read. He brought home lots of books from the library, public library, which I would look at. And one day he brought home 2 astronomy books, one by Fred Hoyle, Frontiers of the Universe, and one by Dennis Sharma, Unity of the Universe. And I read both these cover to cover. I had some trouble understanding some of Sharma, but Fred Hoyle's was at a level that I could manage. I thought, right, I'm going to be an astronomer.
So how old would you have been at that point?
14, 15, probably.
Okay.
And then then the next thing was my father was architect for the observatory in Armagh. And he had to go over there every so often, and occasionally I went with him. And when the staff there heard I was interested in astronomy, they showed me the telescopes and said, you have to work at night. And I knew I needed my bed. Oh, I can't be an astronomer. And then I discovered the new astronomies, things that had started post-World War, World War II, using World War II technology, radio astronomy, X-ray astronomy.
Ah, right.
Radar receivers became radio astronomy receivers, and rockets were used to launch satellites carrying X-ray telescopes and things. But it seemed to me that launching rockets was a bit dicey. It might not succeed and you would have no data for your work, so I focused on radio astronomy.
Okay, and that meant you didn't have to stay up at night?
Nope, you can do radio astronomy day and night because the sun doesn't dominate the way it does the optical. Yeah.
That's an interesting motivation. Is that common amongst radio astronomers?
No, I think I'm just peculiar in needing my sleep. It's quite a disadvantage, I can tell you. But
And so when did you get exposed to it? Because Glasgow wasn't renowned for radio astronomy, was it?
I went to Glasgow because they did do an astronomy degree. But by that stage, I had read enough astronomy books to know that that degree was pretty antiquated. It was quite a lot of spherical trig. So in the end, I didn't do any astronomy in Glasgow. I did straight
physics.
Straight physics. So that was with the idea of doing radio astronomy. But in the final summer that I was a student, the year before I graduated, I worked at Jodrell Bank as an intern for about 6 weeks one summer and learnt a lot about radio astronomy. Actually thought I'd quite like to go to Jodrell Bank to do it, but the other grad students put me off saying, we don't think they'll take a woman. There used to be a woman. She and a male put the dormitory to a use for which it wasn't intended.
And it was the woman who was blamed.
He bragged. Sir Bernard Lovell got to hear of it and said, no women. It's interesting which gender carries the burden of these encounters, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's the problem of having a woman, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Temptation.
They're trouble.
Yes, they're trouble.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay.
Shall we walk off the stage now?
Okay, so Jodrell Bank was out,
Yeah.
which left Cambridge.
Actually, I was heading for Australia. I didn't think I'd get into Cambridge. But the academic year in Australia starts January, February, so I had a few months in hand. So I put in an application to Cambridge just in case. And very much to my surprise, got in. I now understand why. I was Northern Irish. My grant came from the Department of Education in Northern Ireland, and it was attached to me, not the department. So here was a late application from a student who had money, not taken from our departmental allocation.
So they could have an extra student.
Yeah.
Wow. Doesn't matter, does it? Or do you resent that?
No. It took me a long time to suss that one out, I must admit.
Okay.
It wasn't obvious when I got there. But
And how many women were there?
there was one third-year PhD student, and there was one who was postdoc, probably fairly senior postdoc.
That's quite a large number, really.
Yeah, well, you know. The third-year PhD student took me aside and gave me useful information like, the window in that toilet is actually transparent.
Yeah. The things one needs to survive.
Yes.
And aside from that, were they welcoming or did you feel uncomfortable?
No, it was fine. It seemed...
No more,
Nope,
I can't even do it.
definitely
Hello.
not. I mean, there were crazy university regulations, like you had to wear a gown to lectures, and I was going to some lectures in the mornings of my first year, and you couldn't wear trousers with a gown, but I was heading out to the observatory where I needed to wear trousers. So there was kind of a lot of logistics of going backwards and forwards, sorting out things like that.
Were you still fined 6 and 8 pence if you weren't wearing a gown at the right moment?
I don't know, because I never incurred that.
You never got that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there were definitely dress codes. The guys had to wear jackets under their gowns for dining in hall. And there were great discussions about whether these things with knitted sleeves, but, you know, leatherish panels, whether they counted as jackets or not.
Okay.
Yes. The important things about Cambridge.
So your PhD in the end was pretty transformative.
Yeah, by accident, but yes.
Well, all the best science is done by accident, isn't it?
Probably. There's actually some stuff that's done actually quite deliberately and in a planned way, but
But you have to be ready for the accident that tells you the thing you didn't know you were looking for.
Yes.
So how did you define pulsars then?
Well, looking back, I realised I was suffering from imposter syndrome. I'd been in Northern Ireland, York, Glasgow, all in the far northwest. And as a real country bumpkin, I come to this terribly suave place, frightfully confident. Some people very keen to let you know how bright they were. And I think, I'm not that bright. They've made a mistake admitting me. They're going to discover their mistake, and they're going to throw me out. This is absolutely classic imposter syndrome.
I bet if I asked this audience, quite a lot of hands would go up, but they recognise what you're saying.
Yeah.
I won't do it. But.
Now, in the typical imposter syndrome case, the student goes on saying, I'd better leave before they throw me out. And it's one of the issues, you probably have it here, we certainly have it in Oxford, of students taking themselves back off home about day 3 of week 1. And it's highly contagious. They'll probably take some others away as well. But I was a bit of a fighter, so the story went on. They've made a mistake admitting me. They're going to discover their mistake. They're going to throw me out. But until they throw me out, I'm going to work my very hardest so that when they throw me out, I won't have a guilty conscience. I'll know I've done my best. And I just wasn't bright enough for this fantastic place. So I was being really, really thorough, desperately thorough. And that's how I spotted an anomaly, which was at the level of about 10 parts in a million. It really was. I was sick.
Okay, so you spotted it in some miles of paper, is that right?
Yeah, we didn't have, the university had one computer at that stage, less memory than your laptop. And very few academics had time on it. The academics that didn't had grad students, which did the same job as the computer.
Yes.
It's analyze the data.
Right.
So I was dealing with miles, literally miles, of rolls of chart paper. Yeah.
And what stage in your PhD was this? Was this quite early on?
Spent the first 2 years building the equipment.
Right.
And then for the first half of my 3rd year, I was operating it and collecting data.
So the university put out a tweet today saying it was the anniversary. On this day, you discovered the first. Is that right?
I think they've got the year wrong.
No, they said 67.
Right, okay. So it's 51 years.
Yes, no, it wasn't 50 years. It was an anniversary, but it was.
Right, yes.
But it was on this day.
What date are we, 28?
Yeah.
Well, it was either yesterday, today, I can't quite remember which, but end of November.
It was the middle of the night, was it? Yeah.
No, it wasn't. No, it was lunchtime.
Okay. Sensible time to be working.
I skipped my lunch.
Oh.
It was.
So you find an anomaly. And at what point do you think this anomaly is real? Do you wait till you find another anomaly? Or did you immediately say, this is...
Well, the anniversary was after I'd done a whole lot of other observations to suss out what this funny 10 parts in a million thing was.
Right.
And it was the staggering bit. It turned out to be this string of pulses, very, very regular, 1 1/3 seconds. Indeed, I phoned up my supervisor, Tony, who was demonstrating in an undergraduate lab that afternoon and said, hey, Tony, you know that funny bit of scruff? It's a string of pulses, 1 1/3 seconds apart. To which his reaction was, oh, well, that settles it. It's man-made.
So he wouldn't have had you pursue it?
Well, no, not really, but he was pretty certain it wasn't genuine. I couldn't marshal the argument fast enough, but I knew that this thing kept place amongst the stars, because the stars do a 23-hour, 56-minute day, and this thing, whatever it was doing 23 hours, 56 minutes. So it's getting 4 minutes earlier each day, 28 minutes a week, and this has been going on for several months by now. So what interference is it that works to that pattern? Only other astronomers.
I see. So your first reaction was it was someone playing a trick on you?
Not really, no, because I couldn't really see how that would work either.
Yeah.
My first reaction was, this is very peculiar, and we need to look a bit further into it.
And at what point did the little green men enter the conversation?
I think, I regret, I gave it that nickname quite early on, simply because you couldn't refer to, you know that funny pulsing source at 1919 plus 21? You know, you've got to shorten it somehow.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So from the time you first saw it until the time that everyone was convinced this was real and exciting, how long was that?
6 weeks, couple of months.
Okay.
Finding the second one, I found the first 4. Finding the second one was absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
I can remember an agonized discussion about 3 weeks after finding the first one. agonized discussion about, look, we've done most of the tests we can do on this. How do we publish this? We've only got one of them. What scientific journal is going to take us seriously? Are we going to damage our reputation if we try and publish it? And that night I found a second one. And then suddenly it gets a lot better.
Right.
Because this begins to look probably like some new kind of population.
And did you have any idea where to look for that second one?
No.
It was just
doing
good fortune.
the normal chart analysis.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
And a couple of weeks later, I found 3 and 4. So it really does, look like some kind of new, unexpected stellar population. And the thing has to be small, because the pulses are quite sharp. It also has to be big, because the pulse period isn't decaying. It's not running out of energy. So we were almost instantly faced with the conundrum, it's small and it's big.
And how long to resolve that one?
Well, you begin to think a little bit more carefully. It's small because the pulses are sharp, which means it's small in diameter. It's big because the pulse period isn't flagging. It's got lots of energy. So that means it's got big mass. So it's small in size but got big mass.
Right. Okay. And how much did you get involved in that narrative, as it were? Or were you just seen as the person who produced the charts?
For the first one, I was heavily involved. But by after Christmas, I was beginning to say, Tony, when do I stop observing? I've got a huge backlog of chart analysis of these quasars that I'm meant to be finding. My money runs out at the end of September. I've got to finish the chart analysis, write a thesis, blah, 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 blah. So I became more the supplier of data after a bit.
So with that way of describing it, it isn't that people were excluding you so much as you had other things you had to get on with.
I think that was a good excuse for
them, not for you.
Yeah. I did feel a bit...
You felt...
Yes. I mean, I stumbled on that conversation about how we publish this by accident.
Right.
I wasn't invited in from the beginning.
So it wasn't a team meeting. Here is a student who's got this exciting stuff.
No.
It was other people making decisions.
Yeah.
You did put your name on the paper, didn't you?
Yes.
Was that
On
something
both,
you had to
both
fight
the
for?
papers.
Did you have to fight for that?
No.
Okay. So that at least
Yep,
you
that happened,
given
yes.
proper attribution.
But I had, between discovering pulsars 2 and 3, there'd been the Christmas holiday, I'd got home, I'd got engaged, and I reappeared wearing an engagement ring. And I sensed that my status changed with that. Because at that time, married women did not work. Mm-hmm. It was shameful, you probably remember this, it was shameful if a married woman had to work.
Yep.
It meant he couldn't earn enough to keep them both. Yes. So it was, although I hadn't worked this out for myself, it was a signal that I was quitting science.
So you were giving out a message, I'm not serious.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yes. So it was that more than just gender?
I think it was probably predominantly that, but a bit of other gender issues, yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And so we've got to, I don't know, February. We must get on to the rest of your life. We haven't got very far.
I know, yes.
You got to about February, and you were wanting to write up your thesis. Mm-hmm. Did lots of things go on happening without your involvement then while you were...
No, because the second paper was out fairly soon.
Okay.
And the second paper was the other major thing that had to come out, announcing the next 3 pulsars.
So having got all that, okay, you got an engagement ring on, but did you then think, right, my career is now set, I've got this fantastic discovery to my name, I will now go on and be a successful radio astronomer?
I certainly had plans to continue with science. And I hadn't fully worked out the impact of getting married and the attitude of married women, the attitude to married women at that time.
So it became difficult to get a job?
It meant following my husband around the country.
Yeah.
And he had to move jobs every 5 or 10 years to get promotion. So the way we'd work it, he'd say, there's a job going in Dorset. Might there be any astronomy anywhere? No. So he didn't go for it. There's a job going in da-da-da. Might there be? Yes. So he'd go for that. And if he got the job, then I'd write a begging letter to the nearest astronomy place, seeing if they'd have any sort of job for me. And fairly soon there's a kid as well. So
you weren't applying from a position of strength in a way?
No, and I got the kind of job you get when you write begging letters.
Okay.
But while we were there, I'd gradually work my way up the hierarchy. And then husband would say, it's time I moved. So my career has been a bit like snakes and ladders. Work your way up a ladder, work your way up a ladder.
So these papers, which became so famous, really didn't help your career?
Well, I think they did in the sense that the director of wherever I wrote a begging letter to was prepared to find me half a job, money for half a job, so as I could work part-time and keep a hand in. But it meant I moved from radio astronomy via topside ionosphere to gamma-ray astronomy, from gamma-ray astronomy to X-ray astronomy, from X-ray to infrared, and from infrared to millimeter. And then the marriage broke up. And the kid went off to Cambridge.
And then you could start your life.
Yep.
So that was what, 20 years or something?
Yes, something like that.
When you were constantly frustrated? Or did you get some fun out of these?
Oh, there was also fun. And I got to try lots of different kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
But for instance, I landed in X-ray astronomy just as MSSL was launching a satellite, which was hugely successful. And I was on a technical post and in charge of the incoming data. And we should have been scooped by the USA, who had a much better satellite launched a few months later. Their data pipeline didn't work. Ours did. And so that Ariel 5 satellite scooped discovery after discovery. And the exciting things always came in on a Friday, preferably before a bank holiday.
Did that mean you worked over the weekend, or did you go back and look?
Well, I was in charge of the satellite, so I'd be going into the lab to take a quick look at the data on Sunday morning just to check it was operating okay. Usually was, but sometimes wasn't. But yes, I was monitoring it, and I was the lab's rep to the committee that set the observing program and that kind of thing.
So at least there was some satisfaction in that kind of...
And it was hugely exciting, and I learned X-ray astronomy.
Right.
And something similar happened when I went to Edinburgh. I became a scientist, a support scientist associated with a new millimeter wave telescope in Hawaii, just as millimeter wave astronomy boomed. So...
Okay, so you have been in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, maybe not have my name on papers, but
no,
having fun.
You were having, well, I mean, that's quite important too.
Yes. Yeah.
And you were learning, which
Yes.
is also hugely important.
Yes.
But presumably you couldn't have PhD students or anything. You couldn't run other people, as it were.
I've had 2 PhD students.
In your
One
entire life?
is now a professor in the office next door to me in Oxford. It's great to see your PhD student do well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, looking back now, what do you think you should have done?
I'm not sure I could do much different. I mean, not get married would have helped.
Yeah. I mean, I know Julie
not have a
Higgins always
child,
says you've got to marry the right person. You don't... That's
well, even if you marry
easy.
another academic, there's the two-body problem.
Oh, yes.
Getting jobs for both of you in the same place.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're much better off marrying a GP.
Or a school teacher.
Or a school teacher, yes.
Yeah.
Someone who's got a portable career.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know what you could do differently, to be honest.
And that problem, to some extent, hasn't gone away. I mean, the idea that if you turn up with an engagement ring on, people start treating you differently, like to think that's gone away. But the two-body problem is still very, very real.
Yeah.
And someone's career always ends up
Yes.
having...
Compromised.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and I don't know what the answer to that is. And if you have children, it gets more complicated again.
Some universities, probably none in this country, but some universities have, rich universities, have a policy of hiring the spouse as well.
Yes.
Regardless of the abilities of the
Yes.
spouse, they will hire the spouse. They'll find
America-
something for them.
America certainly does that.
Some American, yeah.
Yes, yes. but
Ones
I
in big metropolises don't, because they say there's plenty of other jobs.
Yes, I'm not sure it's not against the law in this country.
It might well be, yeah.
I think,
Yes.
it's a bit like affirmative action.
Yeah.
No, I think that is an ongoing problem. So when did you get your life back?
About age 50, a marriage broke up. Son went off, did a physics degree, King's College. Well, he started doing a physics degree, decided physics was boring, and switched to metallurgy at the end of the first year. So he has a material science
We
degree.
like to think that's just the advantages of the natural sciences tripos
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, yes. He's now teaching physics, but
In a university.
yes, yeah. So, yes, and for the first time in my life, I could go after a job because of what it was, not where it was. And the post of Professor of Physics and Head of Department at the Open University came up. Now, one of the many part-time things I'd done was tutor Open University physics students, which was absolutely brilliant. It was great course material and superb students doing wonderful things against all the odds. It was really, really good. Lots of stories around that. But this position in Milton Keynes came up, and I applied for it and got it. And so I was suddenly, well, within 6 months, head of department. But I had some grad students, and I gradually built up a group, stellar astrophysics, in the Open University, particularly energetic binaries, where the two stars are close. And typically they give out radio waves and X-rays and gamma rays. And
You knew all about it all.
Yep.
Yes.
So we went multi-wavelength.
Right.
Yeah. None of this, segregated by wavelength. And that department is still there with a number of very good astrophysicists.
So you were able to make a real difference, sort of, on the ground.
I got the place more research-focused. A previous policy had been, in order to cover the teaching, we will recruit one theoretician, one solid state, one of this statistical, one of this, one of that. And as somebody said, it's a bit like a zoo. You have a whole lot of specimens, but not a lot of anything. Whereas I came in and said, right, we're going to have a sizable
Focus.
group of astrophysicists. And we got up to something like 30 people, if you count the students. But, the postgraduate students by the time I was done. So.
And by this point, presumably the Nobel Prize had been...
Oh, that was way, way back.
Yes.
That was quite soon after.
It happened fast,
It
did
was
it?
74 or
Should
something
have done
like
my
that.
homework better on that
Yeah.
one. So,
Yeah,
so
so-
when that happened, what was your reaction?
Well, it was a very memorable day, and if you put this in a novel, people would say you were, being too creative. By that stage, I was working at Mullard Space Science Laboratory. I was the support scientist for a satellite which launched that morning. We all came in about 8 o'clock in the morning, and there was a radio link to the launch pad off the coast of Kenya. And we heard the countdown, we heard the launch, we heard the separation of the stages. And after a few hours, we finally drifted away to our desks to get on with other work. And about an hour later, just after midday, a colleague came steaming into my office. Have you heard the news? Oh, God, it's crashed. It was the announcement of the Nobel Prize. His wife had heard it on the news, phoned him up at work, and he'd come roaring around to my office, expecting to see me furious, I think. But actually, I was really, really pleased because the political animal in me came out. There's no Nobel Prize in astronomy.
No.
No Nobel Prize in maths. The story is it's something to do with Professor Nobel's wife,
Yes.
the professor of maths, the professor of astronomy. So no Nobel Prize in those areas. And until then, the physics committee had not recognized anything in astronomy as worthy of the physics prize. And this was the first time any astrophysicists had won the physics prize. And I recognized immediately the importance of that precedence, that other astronomers would walk through that door. And I was quite proud that it was my stars that had converted that rather stodgy physics committee to considering a little bit wider than they had previously.
And did the fury set in thereafter?
No, I wasn't cross. A lot of people were cross on my behalf.
Yeah.
It became known amongst my contemporaries as the No-Bell Prize.
Okay.
Fairly obvious, but
yes.
Yeah.
But no, actually, because some people say, oh, well, Nobel Committee does not give awards to PhD students. But if I remember rightly, I did check this, the year before they'd given it to Brian Josephson and not to Brian Pippard. So they gave it to the student and not the supervisor in that
Certainly,
case.
I wasn't aware it was the year before, but I knew Brian Josephson had got it, yes. That was probably the only student for donkey's years that was recognised by the committee.
Yes, I mean, Andre Geim was a postdoc at least.
Yes.
He was still very young, but he was a postdoc.
Well, it was next with Joe Taylor and Russell Hulse for the binary pulsar.
Right.
And showing that the orbit of this pulsar shrank because of the emission of gravitational radiation. Now, Joe and Russell were much more contemporary, and Joe had to stay in Massachusetts to teach and exiled Russell to the Caribbean, poor lad, to make the observations and do the data analysis.
Right.
So they were a much more equal partnership.
Right, okay. And your presumption would be the Nobel saw that was Tony a professor by that point? I mean, Martin would have been.
No, he wasn't, but he was.
Yeah, okay. So
And there might have been a gender issue as well.
Would not be beyond the realms of possibility, would it? Yeah. Still. Okay, so if we move on again. So, I mean, the interesting thing is that suddenly, I mean, the Breakthrough Prize last year?
This year.
This year.
Like a month ago. No,
it's more
less than that.
No,
the ceremony was the 4th of November.
Oh, okay, but the
announcement was September.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So it was that recent. Okay. So does that feel like a sort of lifetime's recognition finally?
It's hard to put it in any kind of context. It's hard to do anything other than label it as, how they describe it, Oscars for scientists.
Yes.
With the same kind of award ceremony?
Yes. I did once write a rather rude article about the Breakthrough Prize long before you won it for the BBC. So exactly, it's just glitz. It's other people getting off on celebrity in a way, it seems to me.
It's certainly, there's a lot of glitz and all the other Oscar stuff.
Okay,
yes.
Nevertheless, you won. You must have had some satisfaction after that.
Yes, and it's been very interesting to be involved in such a thing. Whilst there is a lot of sort of Oscars and glitz, the committee that makes the award is highly reputable. Headed by people like Ed Witten that you've probably heard of. So and the committee goes on like that. It's got a lot of weight in it. So it's not a trashy process, and it's not a trashy award. What you do with $3 million when you're age 75 is another issue.
Well, what you did with it was incredible. So if you don't know, she gave it all away.
Yep. To make research studentships in physics for people from underrepresented groups in physics.
Within the UK? So is that within the UK or is it international?
It's UK and Ireland.
I'm sorry, yes, okay.
Because the The UK Institute of Physics is
Yes,
the Institute of Physics for the UK and Ireland.
Okay.
And I'm pleased about the and Ireland because that's where I started life.
Yes.
So that's good.
That's very good.
Yeah.
But it's not for international students who want to come to the UK to study, say from
Well,
Africa or something.
It might be. I hope there might be some refugees get it, because a lot of the early refugees from troublesome countries, they're often the people with qualifications.
Yes, who are very shortchanged.
Yeah.
So do you have oversight now in how that's spent? Or have you?
No, I've had oversight in setting the rubric for it.
Right.
And I've helped suggest names of a committee to make the
Right.
allocations. And
Right.
that's the end of my involvement.
I mean, $3 million, that's quite a lot of studentships, isn't it?
It depends whether they're full studentships or whether they're scholarships.
Right.
It also depends whether you just spend the interest or whether you spend down the endowment.
Yeah.
And I have suggested that they spend down the endowment over a 10-year period, something like that. I mean, it is an attempt to improve diversity.
Yep.
For how long will there be a need to improve diversity? Some of these funds, are a real embarrassment because they're set up for those who play Ludo with pink counters, crazy.
Yes, some Cambridge colleges, I think, not this one, have, indigent clergymen's sons from the village of X. Yes,
Yeah.
quite. They are a bit awkward. I don't think
Yes.
Churchill runs to that. So, I mean, you say, how long will we still have this need? What's your best guess on that one? I mean, refugees, one might imagine there will always be that equivalent. But I assume you had women in physics in mind too.
I certainly had women because women are underrepresented in UK physics departments.
Still,
yes. So that's one very big cohort. Black and minority ethnic, particularly black, we're very, very short of.
Yes.
I'd like to see not just women, but more gender diversity in general. I think that could be good. Refugees I've mentioned. Whether they will give such scholarships, stroke studentships to Americans who decide to come and study at a British university, I don't know, but you could argue that Americans are underrepresented in British physics departments.
Okay, but I guess the question I was really asking, do you think that we will move within 10, 20 years to a point where women are not a minority in physics?
20 years maybe, 10 years probably not. But if we can get more women into the system and keep them there, then I'm hopeful.
Well, we are getting more women in the system compared with your day, my day.
Yes.
It's a very gradual slope.
Yes. Well, I'm hoping this will give a bit of an upward trend. And I've gone for grad students rather than undergraduates or masters because grad students are more embedded in a department and maybe will continue in academia. Maybe not, but maybe will continue in academia. So that seemed the simplest way to poke the system.
I should open the session to questions from the floor, but I just wondered, looking back and looking at where we are now, what's your sort of sense? I mean, are you optimistic, pessimistic? There are changes.
Yes.
Not as fast as I'm sure you or I would like. So where do you see things going?
There are shifts. There's considerable shift beginning to happen. Athena Swan, I think, is making a very big difference, particularly now the funding bodies kind of attach your Athena Swan status to funding, so that helps. And Athena Swan's being exported right, left, and centre. It's gone to Ireland, it's gone to Australia, where it's called SAGE. It's just going to Canada. So that's interesting of itself. So I see a considerable change in climate coming about, which hasn't yet resulted in a considerable change in numbers, statistics, but I'm optimistic because people are beginning to take this as a significant issue. And I do believe that diversity, gender and other kinds of diversity, strengthen a research group hugely. Mm-hmm. They make it harder to manage, but they do strengthen it, and they make it more creative. And I think that should lead to other kinds of breakthroughs.
And you think people will recognise that, and therefore it'll be a virtuous circle kind of thing?
I hope so. I hope so. I think Oxford and Cambridge might be the last to recognise it, but...
We can but try to change the
yes.
world. Right, at that point, I should probably throw it open for questions. We have some roving mics.
Hi, thanks so much for a wonderful discussion. I was just wondering, at the time when you found the regular repeating pulses, had you heard of Zwicky's neutron star idea at that point? And did you think, maybe that has the right combination of small and massive, incredibly dense? Or was that something that was just totally alien to you at that point?
We had actually missed a significant paper. We knew that these things called neutron stars had been proposed by some slightly crazy theoreticians decades earlier, and nobody expected to see them because they're so small. But we had missed, and I don't know how we missed, a paper in Nature by Franco Pacini in November, like about 2 weeks before I found the first pulses. One of the big puzzles at that time was what keeps the Crab Nebula shining. It's a nebula that's the remains of an exploded star. The explosion was over 1,000 years ago, and the whole thing ought to be gently dying, and wasn't. And Franco Pacini proposed, suppose in the center of the nebula there's a neutron star with a strong magnetic field, and the magnetic field is offset from the rotation axis, and because it then oscillates like this, it produces magnetic dipole radiation, and we're not quite sure what the plasma density is in the nebula, but suppose this radiation can't get out, it'll heat the nebula. And now we have in the center of the nebula a pulsar, which has an offset magnetic field, which rotates, kicks out radiation. Actually, most of it escapes from the nebula, but obviously has an effect on the nebula as well. But somehow we missed that paper. And it was actually Fred Hoyle who put his finger on it in a really dramatic way. We'd been fairly cautious how widely we talked about this because we were still afraid it was something stupid and obvious, and we still hadn't seen what it was. So we weren't advertising it too widely. But shortly before the paper in Nature was published, Tony gave a colloquium in the old Cavendish, gave it a titillating title, and everybody came, including Fred Hoyle, who sat in the front row. And at the end of Tony's presentation, Fred was the first to speak. And I'll try and do his Yorkshire accent. This is the first I've heard of these things, which was fair enough because we hadn't shouted about it. I don't think it's a white dwarf, which was Tony's favourite model. I think it's a supernova remnant, which we hadn't seriously considered. And the genius of that man was within 40 minutes to go from cold to the right answer. Fantastic. Yeah.
More questions? There's one up there.
In the end, you were talking about the diversity in physics departments. Do you really think it's necessary to have 50% women so that women are not a minority anymore? Or do you think it would just already be good to have, say, 30%? Because I'm not necessarily sure we need 50%. I think what we need would be that everyone who wants to go to university actually decides on their own wish and on their own talents rather than on social pressure, basically. Yes. Which doesn't necessarily mean 50%. It would just mean maybe more than what we see now.
It's certainly very well established, for instance, in business, that a diverse group, whatever way it's diverse, is more robust, more flexible, more successful. It's also harder to manage. The easiest group to manage is one consisting of people like you, exactly like you. But it runs the risk of, because everybody thinks the same way, of reinforcing each other's bad ideas as well as reinforcing each other's good ideas. I wouldn't want to put a number on it, but I think if you can get diversity has many different dimensions to it. It's not just women. The important thing is to get people who think differently. And I think in that respect, a group cannot be too diverse. So, yeah. The other thing that's going through my mind is I have access to international data on women in astrophysics. For those who know what I'm talking about, it's the IAU membership data. And there's huge difference country by country in the proportion of professional astronomers who are female. The English-speaking countries are in a block below the world average. The best countries for the highest number of women in astrophysics are the Catholic Southern European countries, France, Spain, Italy, and South American countries. The worst are India and Japan, no surprises there. The next worst are Northern European countries like Germany and Netherlands. And there's really a very large range. So it's partly to do with probably social conditions and traditions in each of those countries. So I think in terms of what number you're going for might depend on what country you're in.
There are a couple of questions up at the back. Christopher.
I think I remember you used to teach at schools back in the 70s, and from my memory, I mean, your people who taught you said you were very inspirational. One of the things, of course, is that the younger you start people realizing they can do physics, the better, and therefore, it's really almost in primary schools that you need to get girls to realize that they can do physics and engineering too. So the younger you start, the better it is. So by the time they get to postgrad level, it's almost getting a bit late. So what can schools do to inspire women so that they too can be engineers and physicists? Oh, and by the way, I do know people. For some reason, a while back I taught in an international school. A lot of people from Latin America, a lot of the women from Latin America are now engineers. Yeah. So what Brazil has got that Britain hasn't, I don't know. But even at school age, they were already thinking, oh, I can be an engineer. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe that's the sort of the key. The earlier the better.
Yes and no. There's been quite a lot of action by the UK Institute of Physics to influence the number of girls doing physics in schools. But if you concentrate just on the pupils, I think you make a mistake. Because that pupil will go home and say, I want to be a physicist. And parents say, what do you want to do that for? You get more money being a hairdresser or serving petrol on the garage forecourt. It's a whole society issue. And the other thing I'm becoming increasingly aware of is that kids are gendered from a very early age. Primary school kids in this country are into, pink princesses. And that's even before they've started school. Indeed, some people will assert that even the newborn baby is gendered. And certainly there's some evidence that we handle newborn babies or babies differently, depending on whether they're male or female. So I think some of this sets in very, very early. And whilst the schools can do a lot, I wouldn't put it all on the schools.
There was another question just in front.
Thank you very much. What do you think is your biggest contribution to the world? And now that you're here, what do you want to do next?
I don't know. I'm not sure I can answer that, to be honest. It's not the kind of thinking I do. I sort of just get on with it.
There are a couple right at the back, Hilary.
Thank you very much for inspirational conversation. I'm also a radio astronomer. I'm now seriously consider an academic career. I did my PhD. I'm now still doing my PhD. It took me too long to finish my PhD. And at the beginning, I thought I'm really, really bad at it. And now I started to gather my confidence. I really, really want to go for an academic career. And I used to. I don't know you very well. I didn't really know your career, but when I thought about you before, I thought you started high and you ended high. That means you must have a brilliant, smooth career. But just now, I learned that you actually have ups and downs. Yeah. I was wondering whether you can give us some career advice and in terms of how to face the ups and downs in career and how to really pursue what you want in career. Thank you very much.
I think whatever you end up doing, and it may be a sequence of sort of temporary jobs like I have, but whatever you end up doing, you're learning something, picking up some skills. Actually, even if you're at home with a small child, you're learning. If you can get that child to do what you want it to do, you can manage your boss. So you are forever learning and picking up skills, and the art is to identify them, articulate them, and put them on your CV. Besides that, you do the best you can. And it's, I don't think anybody has the ideal career, to be honest.
Right, there was another question just next.
Congratulations on the recent award. And we were talking about diversity in physics departments and just talking about diversity in general in all areas of work. In the recent years, there's been a lot of social work, at least in raising awareness and talks and seminars on all kinds of diversity-related issues. Do you think that that kind of work, the word of mouth kind of thing almost, is going to bear fruits on its own? Or do you think that only through the pressure or the support, depending on how you look at it, of money and actually influencing departments to create scholarships to actually increase, is money the only way that we can actually get more diversity in a variety of places?
I'm pretty disgusted by the way money speaks, but money does speak. The Athena Swan scheme has, I think, had a huge effect on the attitudes in departments, because departments have to look at their data, decide what they're going to do to improve things, make some proposals, and 3 years down the line when their reaccreditation comes up, report on what they've done, whether it's worked. If it hasn't worked because, or we stopped doing that, but we're doing this instead. And it's really focused quite a bit of attention on the diversity in a department and the progress of the people in the department. And I think that's for the good. It may have got a bit too elaborate with too much form filling and box ticking, and we often give it to one of the women in the department to complete, which is not such a bright idea because there are probably not so many women. So there are a number of issues with it, but I'm actually hugely impressed by the way Athena Swan has taken off, expanded, grown, gone international. And whilst it may not be perfect, I find it great that there's so many departments paying attention to those kinds of issues.
There's a question right at the front.
So it sounds like from this discussion that you spent a lot of time navigating really heavily male-dominated spaces and sometimes hostile male-dominated spaces. So I guess I'm a little bit curious about how you handled that, because you talked about what happened, but you didn't talk about what you did next. And the reason I'm curious about this myself is because I'm a historian of radio astronomy, and so it turns out that the only people who do history of radio astronomy besides me are retired radio astronomers.
Yes.
So I often find myself in spaces that are entirely dominated by older male radio astronomers. So I'd be very curious to see what you did.
Right, yes. Yeah. One of the ways I coped as an undergraduate with all the stamping and whistling and catcalling is I discovered that you can control your blushing. I've lost the technique, but you can control your blushing. And it was very important to do so, because if you blushed in the face of that barrage of noise, they simply made more noise. So that was one important thing. I think I've also been quite lucky in that I knew what I wanted to do. And so I could judge whether I was going to tolerate, get through, get over, get round, whatever it was, in order to do what I wanted to do. I recognize that not many people know as early as I did what they wanted to do, and that was a huge advantage. I think the other thing that I've tended to do is to get as much as I can out of whatever situation I'm in as good a humor as I can manage. Sometimes it was a bit bad-tempered because I was really cross about the situation I was in. But if you go at it with a fairly positive attitude, you make friends with other people who are doing the real science, for instance. And so I have my name on a lot of X-ray astronomy papers, simply because I was the person running the satellite and doling out the data and being as helpful and as positive as I could. So, you know, there are some wins to be had that you can't expect to have.
Right, I'll take one more question. So there's one sort of halfway down.
Hi. Sorry, just a quick one. What happened to the imposter syndrome?
Sorry, what happened to?
To the imposter syndrome.
I think it's gradually disappeared. Having survived the PhD, I was one of the few people who completed their PhD in 3 years in that group. Bit unusual, but having done it and, you know, passed the Viva and so on, I gradually began to believe in myself. And in some of the places I worked, people would actually say thank you, and that helps a lot.
Well, I think on that positive note, we should probably stop. There will be drinks in the buttery. If you don't know where that is, follow the crowd, because some people will know where it is. And Jocelyn will be there, so you can try and catch her with the questions that I've cut off. Thank you very much for sharing everything. It's been brilliant.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.